August 1937. The Japanese set a full invasion of China, going through Peking, or modern-day Beijing, and succeeded. With the fall of Peking, the Chinese government decided to open up a new front around Shanghai and attack the Japanese forces around the area. But this turned into a disaster when Japan was successful taking over the entire city and surrounding areas by late November. The imperial military had dominated the city and planned on pushing further into the mainland with Nanjing as their next target. With just over 150,000 troops, they were prepared for an invasion. Compared to China, who only had about a third of the military strength. Though it was discussed about the importance of the city, whether it was worth defending it or not, the Chinese chairman of affairs, Xi Jinping, or Chiang Kai-shek, decided that defenses should be made in order to protect the inland China from the Japanese pushing further into the nation. On top of this, Xi was also hoping other nations would look to Japan as a threat, giving military and financial aid in order to defend against the Japanese. There was a small problem, however, because of the ongoing civil war going on between the Communist Party and the Republic. Nanjing was not favored by most people of the Communist Party. Previously, there had been skirmishes between them and the nation's military, making a sticky situation in the protection of the city. Luckily for Jing, there had been agreements between the Communist rebels and the Republic to cause a ceasefire in order to protect China as a whole, and not allowing it to fall in the hands of the Japanese. Mao knew that he would never be able to push his revolution further without aiding Jing. After the fall of Shanghai, Chiang placed Tang Xingsu as the commander and set up defenses around Nanjing, which has now been heavily populated from refugees fleeing from Shanghai, since both were decimated. By lining trenches, updating city walls, and bringing in more military units, but this was not enough to defend from the Japanese.
December 1st, 1937, the Japanese began attacking from the east of Nanjing, where the river flowed through. Units were moved by sailing ships up the Yangtze River to block any escape via waterway. This included reinforcements and civilians alike. Now, as mentioned before, Tang had already placed defenses around the city. What he had done is he had lifted up the moat so that it was hard for troops just to go right in. You couldn't go in right through tanks, but you had to go in through foot or take a raft over and to get into the city. The gate was closed. They had artillery all around the entire wall of the city to protect it. Ground troops were surrounded all around in the little trenches, waiting for the Japanese army to arrive. The true battle went on for another 8 days after the first initial strike on December 1st. And what happened was the Japanese would find all these different trenches and different areas where the Chinese were set up. They go and strike and attack. They go right for it, other than play a waiting game or doing any strategy to encompass them. They decided just to go straight on in and just go right through them. And the strategy worked for the Japanese. They had a very strong military. Their ground troops were very well trained. They were more trained than the Chinese, and they also had the willingness to go through and die for that cause.
As the Chinese armies retire for mile after mile, as they evacuate city after city and village after village, the guns fire their last shells, planes drop their last bombs, and Japan steps into the government of another section of the country. Until today, the rising sun claims dominion over more than 500,000 square miles of China. 500,000 square miles ravaged by the scorching heat of war.
西の方へ迂回。気を伺って3名の方へ。敵のダウンによりつつ付近にあり合わせた。
On December 10th, 1937, there wasn't any sign of surrender that was coming from the Chinese, and the Japanese decided to go out and fully invade the city. But there was a small problem with invading the city, and that was the moat that was surrounding the gate. And so the Japanese had a hard time getting to the gate because of the Chinese defenses having artillery pointed right at them, right where the gate was. So the Japanese had to come up with a new strategy. They had to find out how they could get over, because it was not big enough to just put any kind of boat, just a big boat on. So what they decided to do was get small, little, almost canoe type of craft boats, and get log wood, and just try to create a bridge that would just go over. While those soldiers were trying to go out and make those bridges, the other soldiers behind them would be covering them with fire, including their own artillery units, and through their ground forces shooting towards at the top of the wall. And so this was a very effective tactic that worked, that allowed the bridges to be built. There were plenty of small little just crafted bridges that the Japanese made, and they were able to cross over and blow up the wall to the city. They blew up the gate and walls surrounding it.
幾度か足を踏み滑らす急傾斜の崖を登る。用意の長橋を城壁に立てかけました。しかるとこの城壁の高さおよそ15メートル、5城に近い石の壁で、しかもほとんど垂直にそそり立っております。上を登る少量と困難。先頭が安藤五長、2番目が中鶴五長。中鶴五長は奇跡的に微小打も終わり、めでたく生き残ってこのことを我々に物語りました。1分間が1時間の長さと思えたそうであります。かくして午後1時15分、日照旗を翻すことができました。
By December 13th, the Japanese had already taken over the entire city. They officially took it over. The Chinese had surrendered, but unknown to the Japanese, a lot of soldiers had already fled from the city and had gone elsewhere, which led to civilians being taken over by the Japanese. And during the period between December 13th until January, there was a large massacre that was going on. They call it the Rape of Nanjing, where women, children were subject to prostitution, subject to rape. Men were often killed, and it was one of Japan's moments in history that really got the world looking and saw how Japan was able to do such horrific things such as this.
松井司令官の長次、
The aftermath of the battle and the massacre had a huge influence on the world after it was found out. It influenced the Soviet Union into giving more support into the Chinese military, though they were a communist state. They also recognized the Communist Party in China and how they were aligned with the Republic of China. This allowed more influences coming into protecting China as a state itself. The massacre was seen as an atrocity and is known even today through the Japanese, who have fully admitted, which is a current thing, they currently had admitted that they did these atrocities and they will no longer deny them, but it is known that these atrocities did happen and it caused a lot for World War II.
屍を我が子に住むは何の文化へこれに見せるはなしといえどもいか親鸞を足に感じをそうにあふるとき思いを共に分かち得られは誠に